Holy Night Unholy Butchering, a Miss Marple mystery. Welcome to Mystery Crackers. I'm Michael, your host for tonight's Miss Marple mystery. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, I'd love to know what's something you've always been curious about. A small habit people have, a place you've never been, or even a mystery that stayed with you for years. Share it with us in the comments. I truly enjoy reading your thoughts. Now then, settle in, and let's begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mary's in the Marsh was, as it always had been, a haven of quiet life. Nestled between undulating hills and bordered by ancient woodlands, it could be said to have a timeless charm, almost untouched by the outside world. There were no hurried footsteps on its cobbled streets, no loud clattering of machinery, only the occasional rustling of trees and the distant hum of bees, busy with the flowers that dotted every garden. It was late autumn, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and the first hints of frost, promising a cold winter. On this particular afternoon, the village hall was filled with the light chatter of well-dressed villagers, gathered for a tea party. The china teapots were polished to a gleam, and every plate of sandwiches, scones, and cakes had been meticulously arranged by the local women, who had long perfected the art of social gatherings. At the centre of the gathering was the elderly Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner by the hearth. Though her presence was unassuming, her keen eyes observed everything with a quiet intensity. She sipped her tea slowly, making no effort to join in the conversation. It was not that she was shy. No, Miss Marple had long ago ceased caring for idle chatter. It was just that, as always, she found herself more interested in what was not said than what was. The conversation around her ebbed and flowed as tea was poured, and Miss Marple's mind wandered over the faces before her. There was Mrs. Eliza Henshaw, a widow with a talent for gossip, who was currently speaking to the younger Mrs. Langley, the doctor's wife. There was Mr. Worthington, a local gentleman farmer, whose weathered face betrayed years of hard labour in the fields, though his tone was always jovial when he spoke. And then, of course, there was Lady Beatrice de Vere, a woman whose presence could not be ignored. With her towering presence, perfectly coiffed hair, and a diamond necklace that might have belonged in a museum, Lady Beatrice was known for her quick wit, but also for a certain sharpness that often cut through the sweetness of village life. The air was thick with small talk, but beneath it, Miss Marple could sense a tension. She didn't need to hear all the words, it was in the way people moved, the way eyes shifted uncomfortably when a subject was broached. Lady Beatrice had, for some reason, taken an immediate disliking to Mrs. Henshaw and made no attempt to hide it. The way Mrs. Henshaw's hand trembled as she reached for her teacup betrayed a hint of fear, though she tried to mask it with a forced smile. As the clock on the wall struck 4, a sudden hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the door, where a shadow lingered before stepping into the room. It was Edmund Cartwright, the local solicitor. His arrival was not unexpected, but his air of hurriedness was. He nodded at the assembled guests, but his eyes flickered with something Miss Marple could not quite place. Well, Miss Marple mused under her breath, though she did not speak aloud. There is always a storm before the calm, and today I do believe I've sensed it. The village had long prided itself on its tranquillity, yet today a subtle shift was in the air. The slightest unease hovered like a faint fog, imperceptible to most, but to Miss Marple it was unmistakable. As the party continued, She leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly resting on her teacup. Her mind wandered, observing the movements of the villagers around her. But it was the way Mrs. Henshaw's eyes darted toward the window that drew her attention most. The woman's unease was palpable, and Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder what it was she feared. And then, without warning, the door to the hall opened again, this time more violently than the first, as though it had been slammed against the wall by a gust of wind. But there was no wind. It was Lady Beatrice. She had come to the gathering late, as usual. Her mouth was pressed into a thin, disapproving line, and her sharp eyes scanned the room as if searching for something or someone before resting on Mrs. Henshaw. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp as she observed the subtle exchange of glances between the two women. There was something more here than met the eye. Perhaps, she mused, the conversation on the surface would provide no answers. But if she waited, if she observed just long enough, perhaps the truth would make itself known. As the day wore on, the conversation shifted. The seemingly innocuous tea party had turned, bit by bit, into a scene where buried emotions simmered just below the surface. There was laughter, but it lacked its usual warmth. And Miss Marple, with her remarkable gift of observation, couldn't help but feel that something was coming. Something that would shake the quiet village to its very core. The next morning, the village would awake to a shocking discovery. But for now, Miss Marple remained still, letting the storm build quietly. Certain that soon the veil of civility would be torn away, and the darkness beneath would be revealed. Chapter 2. The following morning, the village of St. Mary's in the Marsh was shrouded in a thick mist that hung low over the cobblestone streets like a heavy curtain. The village, which had once seemed so steadfast and secure, now felt different. There was a nervous energy in the air that was palpable, even to the youngest of children. Miss Marple, however, did not feel the same unease. Her senses were sharp, honed by years of observing human nature. She had seen how the village had reacted before, how any ripple, no matter how small, would spread quickly, becoming a wave of whispered gossip. And now, as she sat by the window sipping her tea, she could almost hear the village's collective breath held in anticipation, waiting for something that deep down it knew was coming. The discovery had been made earlier that morning. Lady Beatrice de Vere had been found in her study, slumped over her desk, dead. At first, there had been disbelief, shock, and a great deal of confusion. But now, the police were on the scene, and a steady stream of villagers gathered outside the house, their faces drawn and pale, whispering in hushed tones. As the news spread, Miss Marple couldn't help but notice how quickly the reactions varied. Mrs. Henshaw, who had been present at the tea party the day before, appeared at the centre of a small group, her voice trembling as she spoke in quiet tones. Her hands, always so poised, were now wringing the lace of her gloves in a way that suggested more than simple shock. Others stood further away, their faces unreadable, the air around them filled with a tension that only Miss Marple could fully sense. There was Mr. Worthington, who had been polite but distant throughout the afternoon tea. He now stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the house, though it was unclear whether he was concerned for the situation or simply put off by the intrusion of police into the quiet of his day. Among the crowd, there was one person who seemed unusually calm. Edmund Cartwright, the local solicitor, who had arrived late to the party, stood a few paces away from Miss Marple, speaking to one of the constables in low measured tones. His face was pale, but there was something in his eyes that suggested more than simple surprise. Miss Marple's attention lingered on him for a moment longer than it did on the others. His calmness, despite the horror that had occurred, struck her as curious. As the morning wore on, the village continued to buzz with nervous energy. Gossip quickly turned to speculation, with villagers eager to point fingers, as if finding an answer would somehow alleviate their discomfort. Whispers of motive swirled, each more outlandish than the last. Had Lady Beatrice been involved in some illicit affair? Was there a financial dispute between her and one of the other villagers? Was the death part of some larger conspiracy? Miss Marple, as ever, kept a quiet distance from the spectacle. She had no interest in idle gossip, but she had learned over the years that these initial reactions often told more about the people involved than anything else. What they said in hushed voices, what they refused to acknowledge, and how they interacted with one another. These were the clues that mattered. She had learned enough in the EI's short span of time since hearing the news. The body, it seemed, had been discovered by Lady Beatrice's maid, who had entered the study to find her employer slumped over in her chair. The desk was littered with papers, most of which appeared to be of little consequence. What had caught the maid's attention, however, was a small glass vial that had rolled off the edge of the desk and fallen to the floor. The vial had been empty, but in its wake there was a faint, almost imperceptible odour of almonds in the air. Miss Marple took a slow breath, letting the information settle in her mind. Poison, she thought, not in the dramatic fashion of a grand dinner party, but in a quiet, calculated way. An unseen hand that had slipped into Lady Beatrice's life, unnoticed by the many people who had interacted with her in the days before her death. A death that until now had seemed so impossible in this peaceful village. By midday, the police had cordoned off the area, and the villagers had begun to return to their homes, though none could resist the temptation to gossip. Miss Marple, however, had spent the morning in quiet observation, noting the behaviour of the various people she had seen the day before. She found herself drawn to one person in particular, Mrs. Henshaw. Despite the woman's age and frailty, there was a certain urgency to her movements now. She had been among the first to arrive at the scene of the crime, but Miss Marple had noticed something else. When Mrs. Henshaw had spoken to the constable, her voice had trembled. But more telling was the way she had avoided looking at the body. Her gaze had darted away, as if unwilling to confront the very reality of what had happened. Miss Marple was well aware that people often reacted in unexpected ways to death, especially in a community as tightly knit as St. Mary's. But something in Mrs. Henshaw's response struck Miss Marple as off. Was it fear, guilt, or was it something deeper, something connected to the woman's past that Miss Marple had yet to uncover? As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage, her mind turning over the events of the past 24 hours. She could feel the villagers' eyes on her as she passed, curious, expectant, wondering if Miss Marple, with her vast knowledge of human nature, had already uncovered the truth. But she knew better than to rush into conclusions. She had seen too many cases unravel too quickly, with too many innocent people swept into the frenzy of false accusations. The truth, Miss Marple knew, would reveal itself in time. And when it did, it would be because of her careful observations and her patient understanding of the people around her. For now, the village would continue to speak in whispers, but Miss Marple would remain quiet, watching, listening, waiting. Chapter 3. The following days unfolded with a peculiar quietness in St. Mary's in the Marsh. Though the murder of Lady Beatrice had shattered the Aida village's calm, the surface of daily life had returned to a sense of normality, albeit one that felt thin and fragile, like a veneer over a great chasm. Miss Marple, however, had no interest in the village's appearance of calm. She had long known that such things were fleeting, always masking the deeper currents of human nature that surged just beneath the surface. The villagers, she observed, had not yet grasped the full weight of what had occurred. How could they? The crime was too new, too unnatural. It was early morning, and the sun was fighting through the mist, casting a muted glow over the cottage-lined streets. Miss Marple, dressed simply in her usual grey dress and cardigan, walked through the village square toward the constable's office. Her gait was deliberate, her expression composed. She had no plans to investigate in the brash way others might expect. No, Miss Marple preferred her own method: patience, observation, and above all, listening. Inside the constable's office, she was greeted by Constable Roberts, a steady and dependable man with a deep sense of duty but little aptitude for true detective work. He smiled politely, though Miss Marple could see the tension in his shoulders. The murder of a prominent villager was not something that happened often in St. Mary's, and he was clearly struggling with the enormity of the task at hand. "Miss Marple," he said with a touch of surprise, "I didn't expect to see you here. Not many of the villagers have come forward to offer their assistance." "I'm sure you're doing your best, Constable," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but measured. "But I thought it might be useful to speak with you about the case. You see, I've observed some things that may be of interest." Roberts hesitated, a slight furrow forming between his brows. He seemed unsure whether to be offended or grateful. "Of course, Miss Marple, but I must insist, this is an official investigation. The police are handling it." "I understand entirely," she said, "but you see, sometimes the smallest details, things that might seem insignificant to someone focused on the bigger picture, can reveal the most telling truths." Constable Roberts studied her for a moment, then gave a resigned nod. "Very well, Miss Marple. You've earned my trust, as always. What is it that you've observed?" Miss Marple's voice was calm and deliberate as she spoke, recounting the details of the crime she had gathered from the village gossip and the news she had heard herself. "I've been thinking about Lady Beatrice's last days," she began. "From what I gathered at the tea party, she was in good spirits, but I suspect that beneath that calm exterior there may have been something more troubling." Roberts looked perplexed. "Troubling? Like what?" "Well," Miss Marple said, tapping her fingers lightly on her knee, "Lady Beatrice had a certain way about her, didn't she? Always impeccably groomed, always in control. But that kind of control often hides something else, something that people in this village may not have been privy to." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. The constable, sensing a shift in the conversation, leaned forward slightly. "Do you know who she was closest to, in a personal sense?" Miss Marple asked. Roberts scratched his chin. "Closest? I suppose that would be Mr. Cartwright. They've known each other for years." "Interesting," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "And what about Mrs. Henshaw? She seemed quite uneasy during the tea party. I wonder if her anxiety was more than just a reaction to the murder itself." The constable nodded slowly. "Mrs. Henshaw. Yes, I've heard she and Lady Beatrice had some disagreements in the past, some old family matters, but I don't see how that would be relevant now. She didn't seem the type to—" to murder. Miss Marple finished the thought for him. I wonder, Constable, if you might be looking at this from the wrong angle. You see, it's never the obvious ones who are guilty, but those who are hiding something far deeper. By midday, Miss Marple had spent hours in the constable's office, quietly probing, listening, and offering insights that many would have dismissed as trivial. The villagers, for all their good intentions, had missed something. The reactions they had witnessed, the way they had spoken about Lady Beatrice's death, were no more than surface-level responses to a crime that went far deeper than anyone could yet fathom. Her next stop was the village hall, where the community had gathered to discuss the ongoing investigation. Miss Marple knew that this would be where she could observe the villagers at their most revealing. The police might have their suspects, but the villagers had their own theories, their own suspicions, and more importantly, their own secrets. It was there that Miss Marple observed a peculiar scene. Mrs. Henshaw, standing alone near the corner. Her back rigid, her gaze flickering around the room as if she was searching for someone or something. Miss Marple took a subtle step closer, pretending to examine the village bulletin board. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Mrs. Henshaw's hands, which were trembling, and her lips, which were pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the widow for a moment longer, taking in the signs of anxiety. She wasn't just nervous about the crime. There was something more. A personal connection to the events, something that wasn't immediately visible. She moved slowly toward the woman, making her way through the crowd with careful steps. She waited until the time was right, then spoke gently. Mrs. Henshaw, she said, her voice soft but clear. I understand this must be terribly difficult for you. But if you need someone to talk to, you know I'm always here. The older woman jumped, slightly, her eyes wide for a moment before she composed herself. She smiled, though it was forced, and nodded. I'm fine, Miss Marple. Just a little shaken. You know how it is. I do, Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing subtly. But you see, I've learned that people often hide their true feelings. Perhaps there's something you'd like to share. Mrs. Henshaw glanced around, her eyes darting nervously. She took a deep breath, then spoke in a low voice, barely audible over the hum of conversation. I don't know, Miss Marple, but I've heard things about Lady Beatrice, things that, well, I'm not sure how to say this. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her interest piqued. You've heard things? Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, then nodded, things that suggest it might not have been an accident after all. But I don't know who to trust with such information. You understand, don't you? The rest of the conversation unfolded with quiet words and half-formed thoughts. But Miss Marple had already gathered what she needed. Mrs. Henshaw knew something. She had heard whispers, but she had not yet dared to speak them aloud. That night, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her mind worked over the threads she had gathered. Mrs. Henshaw's anxiety, Edmund Cartwright's calm, and the strange, almost forgotten vial that had been found in Lady Beatrice's study. All of these were pieces of a puzzle, each one leading her closer to the truth. And in the quiet of the night, Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. The game, it seemed, was afoot. Chapter 4. The fog had lifted by the time Miss Marple ventured out again, but the air still carried the chill of unease that seemed to have settled into the village. The discovery of Lady Beatrice's death had only deepened the sense of something amiss. Yet, it was not just the villagers who were now on edge. The local police, under the command of Inspector Harris, had begun their formal investigation, and already the first suspect had been named. Edmund Cartwright. Miss Marple was not one to jump to conclusions. It was true that Cartwright had been close to Lady Beatrice, as several villagers had confirmed, and it was true that his calm, almost too measured reaction to the news of her death had stood out to her. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that people often masked their true feelings in different ways, some with exaggerated emotion, others with stoic calm. It was never as simple as it seemed. Still, the fact that Edmund Cartwright had already become the focus of the investigation piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. The villagers, of course, had their suspicions, their whispering growing louder with each passing day. Some suggested it was a crime of passion. Others wondered whether it was a financial dispute. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust gossip, however persistent. Her next visit was to the village pub, where many of the men, including Cartwright, would gather after the day's work. She had no intention of making a scene. No, she was simply there to listen, to observe. Inside the pub, the warmth of the fire contrasted with the biting cold outside, and the clink of glasses created a familiar rhythm that Miss Marple had grown accustomed to over the years. As she made her way to the corner where the men usually sat, she could hear Cartwright's voice rising above the others, speaking with a deliberate calmness that made her pause for a moment. "Gentlemen, I assure you, I had no hand in Lady Beatrice's death," Cartwright was saying, his tone smooth, but with an edge of something, resentment perhaps. "I find it absurd that anyone would even think that I might be involved." Miss Marple observed Cartwright closely as he spoke. His hands, though held steady at the table, betrayed a faint tremor, and his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, flicked over the others, gauging their reactions. He was a man accustomed to control, and in the face of suspicion, he was attempting to maintain it. But Miss Marple had seen enough to know that control could be a facade. "It's just the shock talking, Mr. Cartwright," one of the other men replied, raising his glass. "We all know how upset you were over Beatrice's death. You were practically inseparable, after all." A few of the other men nodded in agreement, but Miss Marple saw how Cartwright's smile faltered for just a split second, an imperceptible flicker that passed as quickly as it appeared. "Of course, I was upset," Cartwright said evenly. "But I assure you, I had no reason to harm Lady Beatrice. She was a force of nature, but she had her own troubles, her financial dealings, her dealings with others. She had a way of making things complicated." Miss Marple allowed the conversation to wash over her, her attention fixed not on the words themselves, but on Cartwright's mannerisms. He was deflecting. The way he spoke of Lady Beatrice's complicated dealings was too casual, too rehearsed. It seemed as though he was trying to distance himself from any deeper connection, particularly one that might have involved financial matters. Before long, Cartwright's voice was swallowed by the general noise of the pub. Miss Marple, however, was far from finished. She needed to know more about this complicated relationship, something that Cartwright had tried so hard to downplay. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Henshaw, hoping to uncover more about Lady Beatrice's financial matters. Mrs. Henshaw had been Lady Beatrice's confidant for years, and it was well known that the two women had frequently shared private conversations. If anyone knew about the true nature of Lady Beatrice's dealings, it would be her. "Mrs. Henshaw, I do hope you're feeling better today," Miss Marple said gently as she entered the widow's modest sitting room. "I realize this has been a trying time for you." Mrs. Henshaw looked up from her knitting, her hands stilling in her lap. She nodded, though her eyes remained distant. "I've been better, Miss Marple, but I'm afraid I still don't know what to make of all this. Lady Beatrice, I just can't believe she's gone." "I understand," Miss Marple said, "but I must ask, have you ever heard Lady Beatrice speak of any financial problems? Any troubles that might have come from her dealings with others?" Mrs. Henshaw's gaze faltered for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. "Oh dear. You know, Miss Marple, Lady Beatrice had many admirers, but she also had many enemies. People she couldn't trust. She had dealings with Mr. Cartwright, certainly, but I don't know if that's the whole picture." "Do you think Mr. Cartwright might have been involved in something less than above board?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft yet probing. Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, then lowered her voice to a whisper. "I've heard rumours, Miss Marple, about Lady Beatrice's investments, her property dealings. Some of them didn't sit right with me. She was too good at playing the game, you see. Too good at making things look one way when they were actually quite different." Miss Marple's heart quickened slightly. "You think Mr. Cartwright knew about these dealings?" Mrs. Henshaw looked over her shoulder, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I do, and I think Mr. Cartwright had more to gain than anyone else. But that's all I can say for now, Miss Marple. I'm only telling you because I trust you." As Miss Marple left Mrs. Henshaw's cottage, her mind was racing. There it was again, Cartwright's connection to Lady Beatrice's finances. The more Miss Marple learned about the solicitor, the more it seemed that his carefully crafted persona was a mask to hide something far more calculating beneath. But there was still so much more to discover. Mrs. Henshaw had only given her a glimpse, a hint of what might lie beneath the surface. And then there was the mysterious vial, the faint scent of almonds. Poison, it seemed, was the weapon of choice. As she made her way down the village road, Miss Marple knew that Cartwright was merely the beginning. The game was more intricate than she had first suspected, and she would need to tread carefully. There were more secrets to uncover, more players in this drama that had yet to reveal themselves. And Miss Marple, as always, was patient. She would wait for the truth to emerge, piece by piece, until the moment arrived when the killer's identity would be laid bare for all to see. Chapter 5. The weather had grown colder still, and with it, the village of St. Mary's seemed to have grown more subdued. The news of Lady Beatrice's death was no longer the subject of whispered conversations. It had become the quiet obsession of the villagers, filling the gaps in their daily routines. Yet, Miss Marple noticed something that others had not. The threads of tension that had previously been only faintly visible were now thickening, binding the villagers together in ways that were far from comforting. Her thoughts had become more focused on one aspect of the investigation in particular, the small vial that had been discovered in Lady Beatrice's study. The vial had been tossed aside carelessly, as if the person who had left it had not yet fully realized its significance. Yet to Miss Marple, the vial was the key. The faint smell of almonds had lingered on the room, and although others might have dismissed it as a trick of the senses, Miss Marple knew better. It was cyanide, a deadly poison, and its discovery was not an accident. The police had been quick to identify the vial's contents, but they had been slower to connect it to the crime. There had been no mention of cyanide in the initial reports, and the police had focused instead on Cartwright's possible motives and his involvement with Lady Beatrice. But Miss Marple knew that this was not a matter of passion or betrayal. No, the murder had been calculated, precise, and methodical. Her visit to the village hall that morning had been instructive. The constables had been busy investigating Cartwright's financial dealings with Lady Beatrice, but Miss Marple had no intention of rushing into the obvious answers. Instead, she had kept her distance, observing, waiting for the smallest clue to present itself. It was on her way back from the hall that she found herself in front of the village's small post office. Her steps slowed as she passed, and something caught her eye. An envelope, half hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It was an odd place to leave something, and Miss Marple's curiosity flared. She stopped and crouched down, brushing her fingers over the cold stone. The envelope was plain, unmarked except for a faint impression of a name scrawled on the front. It was not Lady Beatrice's name, nor was it Cartwright's. It was a name Miss Marple knew well, though she had not heard it in years. "Mrs. Margaret Ellis," she whispered to herself. Margaret Ellis was an old acquaintance of Miss Marple's, a woman who had lived in the village long before the current generation had taken over. She had been a quiet, unassuming woman, always with a kind word for everyone. But her life had been shrouded in mystery. She had vanished several years ago, and though the villagers had never spoken of it, Miss Marple had always wondered what had happened to her. Carefully, Miss Marple slipped the envelope from its hiding place, feeling its weight in her hands. She opened it gently, her fingers trembling with anticipation. Inside, there was a letter, and as she unfolded it, she began to read. The letter was short, but its contents sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. It was written in a careful, steady hand, though the words themselves were hurried, as if the writer had been in a great rush to convey something important. "If anything happens to me, you must tell the truth. Lady Beatrice is not who she seems. She has been involved in things far darker than anyone knows. I will expose everything if I must, but I fear she will find out before I can act. She knows too much, and I am afraid of what she might do. The vial, it will be found, and when it is, you must remember that I tried to stop her." The letter ended abruptly, with no signature, no indication of who had written it. Miss Marple folded the paper slowly, her mind racing. The contents were cryptic, but they revealed something important, something that could change the course of the investigation. Lady Beatrice had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had realized. There was a darkness surrounding her, one that Miss Marple could not yet fully grasp. Miss Marple wasted no time in returning to the village hall, where she was certain the police had already gathered. As she entered, she caught sight of Constable Roberts, who had been speaking with Inspector Harris. Both men looked up at her with mild surprise, though they quickly masked it with polite nods. "Miss Marple," Roberts said, his voice strained, "what brings you here today?" "I've found something," Miss Marple said simply, her eyes sharp. She unfolded the letter and handed it to him. "It's a letter I found hidden in the post office. It's not signed, but I believe it may be crucial." Roberts scanned the letter quickly, his brow furrowing. "This doesn't make any sense. What does it mean by 'she will find out'? What is this about the vial?" "I believe Lady Beatrice was involved in something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "The vial you found, could it have been planted by someone who was trying to stop Lady Beatrice from exposing something?" Inspector Harris, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke. "You think Lady Beatrice was murdered because she knew too much?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. I believe the vial was not just a tool for her death. It was a symbol of something much larger, something hidden in plain sight." Roberts exchanged a glance with Harris before turning back to Miss Marple. "What do you suggest we do, then?" "Look closer," she said simply. "The answers are here, in the village, but they are buried under layers of deceit and fear." As Miss Marple left the hall, she felt a sense of quiet determination. The letter had given her a new direction, a new thread to pull. It was not just a financial dispute, nor was it a crime of passion. It was something deeper, more convoluted. Someone had been trying to protect a secret, and in doing so, had sealed Lady Beatrice's fate. And now, Miss Marple would unravel it, piece by piece, until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 6. The morning fog had not yet lifted when Miss Marple made her way through the village. Her mind was still occupied with the letter she had found, the cryptic words of a desperate plea from someone long gone. The name, Margaret Ellis, echoed in her thoughts as she made her way to the edge of the village. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The truth was beginning to form, but it was still unclear. An image half formed in the mist. Miss Marple had no intention of jumping to conclusions, nor did she believe in coincidences. She had learned over the years that the smallest details often held the greatest weight. The letter had confirmed something she had long suspected. Lady Beatrice had been involved in matters far darker than anyone had guessed. But what exactly was she hiding? And who had been desperate enough to kill her to keep those secrets buried? The constable's office was quiet when Miss Marple arrived. Constable Roberts was seated at his desk, a stack of papers before him. His gaze lifted when she entered, and he gave her a nod of acknowledgement. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that spoke of the mounting pressure of the investigation. "Miss Marple," he said, standing as she approached, "I'm afraid things have taken a rather complicated turn." "Complicated how?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but focused. "Well," Roberts began, his hands slightly trembling as he sorted through the papers, "we've been looking into Lady Beatrice's finances, and it seems she wasn't just dealing with personal investments. She had several offshore accounts, and the more we dig into them, the murkier it gets. There are large sums of money being funneled through various channels, money that doesn't seem to have a legitimate source." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Her interest piqued. "Offshore accounts? Are there any names associated with them?" Roberts paused before continuing. "That's the odd thing. Some of the names are known to us, people from the village, and others are not. But there is one name that keeps cropping up. Edmund Cartwright." "Cartwright?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "The solicitor?" "Yes. It seems he was involved in managing a number of these accounts," Roberts confirmed. "But there's no clear indication of what exactly he was doing with the money. It's all very convoluted." Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, letting the new information settle into place. Cartwright's involvement in Lady Beatrice's finances had been a suspicion, but now it was becoming something more, something darker. "Do you think Cartwright knew about the letter I found?" Miss Marple asked, her tone more to herself than to Roberts. He shook his head. "We haven't told anyone about the letter. Only you and I know of its existence." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Good. Then we must continue to tread carefully. There are still pieces missing from this puzzle, and I believe it's time we spoke with a few more people who might know more than they let on." The next stop was the village hall, where the gossip still flowed like an unchecked river. The air inside the hall was thick with tension, and Miss Marple could sense that the villagers were beginning to feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on them. Their once friendly conversations had turned to whispered suspicions, and the normal warmth of the village had begun to turn cold. She spotted Mrs. Henshaw at a table near the window, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed out at the garden. The older woman's face was etched with worry, and Miss Marple noticed that she was fidgeting with a small, delicate handkerchief, an action that was completely out of character for her. "Good morning, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple greeted as she approached the table. "I trust you're well today." Mrs. Henshaw looked up, startled, then gave a weak smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm not sure what to think anymore. This whole thing with Lady Beatrice has just, well, it's turned everything upside down." "I understand," Miss Marple said, taking a seat across from her. "But I must ask, Mrs. Henshaw, do you know anything more about Lady Beatrice's financial dealings? The offshore accounts, perhaps?" Mrs. Henshaw's eyes flickered, and for a moment she appeared hesitant. "I've heard whispers, Miss Marple. Lady Beatrice wasn't the kind to talk openly about money matters, but I did hear her mention someone, a man named Gregory West. He was her business partner, I believe, though I never met him personally." "Gregory West," Miss Marple repeated, her mind already turning over the new name. "What else can you tell me about him?" Mrs. Henshaw shook her head. "Not much, I'm afraid, but I remember Lady Beatrice was always on edge whenever his name came up." She'd changed the subject quickly, and I think she was afraid of something, afraid of what might happen if his dealings ever came to light. Miss Marple made a mental note of the name. Gregory West was another piece to this growing puzzle, and one she was determined to investigate further. As Miss Marple left the village hall, she felt the familiar weight of the investigation pressing down on her shoulders. The social web of St. Mary's was more complicated than she had anticipated. Lady Beatrice's life, it seemed, had been filled with secrets that had remained buried for too long. But there was one more person Miss Marple needed to speak with before she could make any further moves. Lady Beatrice's maid, who had discovered the body. Her name was Alice, and Miss Marple had seen her at the village hall earlier in the week, her face pale and nervous. When Miss Marple arrived at the small cottage where Alice lived, the maid answered the door with a hesitant smile. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she appeared to have been crying recently. "Miss Marple," Alice said softly, "I didn't think anyone would come by today. Not after everything that's happened." "I understand," Miss Marple replied kindly, "but I have a few questions if you don't mind." Alice stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter. The cottage was small but tidy, with a few personal touches, handmade lace curtains, a faint scent of lavender. But Miss Marple's attention was not on the decor, it was on Alice herself. The maid's demeanour, though polite, held an air of defensiveness. "I wanted to ask you about the day you found Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple began. "Was there anything unusual about her behaviour in the days before her death?" Alice hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. She was distracted, as if she were lost in thought. And there were times when she seemed to be looking over her shoulder, like someone was watching her. But I thought it was just my imagination. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice gentle. "Did she ever mention Gregory West or Edmund Cartwright to you?" Alice's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "How do you know about Mr. Cartwright? And West, too? I don't know what to say." Miss Marple smiled warmly, her tone reassuring. "You don't need to tell me anything you're not comfortable with, but anything you do remember, however small, might be important. Alice's eyes shifted to the side, and for a long moment Miss Marple waited. Finally, Alice spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I think Lady Beatrice was trying to leave something behind, something that could expose Mr. Cartwright. She was going to meet with someone the night before she died, someone named West. Miss Marple stood, her mind racing. She had not expected this confession, but now the pieces were falling into place faster than she had anticipated. Edmund Cartwright, Gregory West, the letter, the vial, everything was converging. But she still didn't have all the answers. There was more to this web of deceit, and Miss Marple would untangle it, one thread at a time. Chapter 7. The air in St. Mary's was thick with the scent of impending change. The first chill of winter had crept into the village, and with it the village's mood had shifted once again. What had started as a simple mystery, a murder in a quiet village, had unfolded into something far more intricate and dangerous. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, now knew that the web she had been slowly untangling was far more complicated than she could have guessed. The name Gregory West echoed in her thoughts as she made her way to the small cottage on the edge of the village where Lady Beatrice had once met with him. Mrs. Henshaw's offhand mention of him had set the stage for something more, but it was Alice, the maid, who had given her the final nudge. Gregory West was the key, and Miss Marple was determined to find him. Village constables had been working tirelessly to track him down, but Gregory West seemed to have vanished. No one in the village seemed to know his whereabouts, and the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she suspected that his disappearance wasn't an accident. It was intentional. West knew something important, and it was that knowledge that had likely led to Lady Beatrice's death. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her thoughts as sharp and focused as ever. She had learned so much over the past days, but now she needed to put all of the pieces together. There was something that didn't quite sit right in her mind. Something about Cartwright's behaviour, the letter, and the growing web of lies. But the more she considered it, the more she realised the mystery wasn't as clear-cut as it appeared. And this revelation came with a sharpness that Miss Marple had not anticipated. As she walked past the village inn, Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the sound of raised voices from inside. She paused, considering for a moment, and then turned toward the door. It was the perfect time to make another quiet observation, to catch snippets of conversation that might reveal more than the villagers realized. Inside, the warm glow of the fire illuminated the faces of several familiar figures. Mr. Worthington, the farmer, was seated at a table with Mrs. Langley, the doctor's wife, and a few other locals who seemed deep in conversation. Miss Marple's entrance did not go unnoticed, and she smiled politely as she made her way toward an empty chair. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Langley said, looking up from her tea with a knowing smile, "have you solved it yet?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, amused by the question. "Solved what, Mrs. Langley?" "Oh, come now. We all know you've been observing us," the doctor's wife continued, a twinkle in her eye. "We're all waiting to see how it ends. It's like one of your stories." "I don't have any answers yet," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but thoughtful. "But I'm getting closer." The conversation shifted then, back to the subject at hand, Lady Beatrice's death. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting the way the villagers spoke about Cartwright and the sudden growing consensus that he had been involved. But as she listened, her mind began to piece together something unsettling. The villagers' theories, though based on fact, seemed too neat, too obvious. And Miss Marple knew that when things seemed too neat, it was often a sign that something had been hidden in plain sight. As she left the inn later that afternoon, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Gregory West. The fact that his name had surfaced again, in connection with Lady Beatrice's mysterious dealings, was no coincidence. But there was more to it than that. Alice's description of Lady Beatrice's behaviour, paranoid, looking over her shoulder, was a vital clue. Lady Beatrice had been afraid, and Miss Marple now suspected that it wasn't just fear of exposure. It was fear of someone in the village. The realization hit her with an odd clarity. She needed to speak with the village's oldest resident, the woman who had lived in St. Mary's longer than anyone else. Mrs. Pembroke had been the village gossip for years, but her memory was sharp, and she often knew things that others did not. If anyone could shed light on Gregory West, it was her. Miss Marple made her way to the small cottage at the edge of the village where Mrs. Pembroke lived. The windows were clouded with age, and the scent of burning wood wafted from the hearth inside. Miss Marple knocked gently, and the door creaked open. "Well, well, if it isn't Miss Marple," Mrs. Pembroke said, her voice cracking slightly. "Come in, my dear. I was wondering when you'd come to see me." "I do hope I'm not interrupting," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. "Oh, not at all," Mrs. Pembroke replied, "though I can't say I'm much good for company these days. But I do have memories to share." Miss Marple smiled. "I'm sure you have quite a few." "Indeed," Mrs. Pembroke said, sitting in a worn armchair near the fire. "But I'm not the one you're here to talk to. It's Gregory West you're after, isn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "You know of him?" "Know of him." Mrs. Pembroke laughed softly. "He's been in and out of this village for years. But it's not just his name you should be looking at, Miss Marple. It's what he left behind." Miss Marple leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. What did he leave behind? Mrs. Pembroke's eyes gleamed. "Oh, he left more than just a trail of debts. Gregory West was more than just a man of business, you see. He was tangled up with some very dangerous people. But the most dangerous of all was Lady Beatrice herself." Miss Marple stayed with Mrs. Pembroke for an hour, listening intently as the older woman recounted her memories of Gregory West. What she learned in that time confirmed much of what Miss Marple had already suspected. West had been involved in something far darker than mere financial schemes. Lady Beatrice had been part of a much larger, far-reaching operation, one that had begun to unravel even before her death. But there was one final detail that stood out, something Miss Marple could not yet fully understand. Mrs. Pembroke had hinted at it, but her words were cryptic, wrapped in mystery. All Miss Marple knew was that Lady Beatrice had been on the verge of exposing something vast, something dangerous. The puzzle was nearly complete. As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, she felt the pieces of the mystery fall into place one by one. But there was still one thing that eluded her. What was Gregory West's true role in all of this? And how far had he gone to protect his secrets? As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple knew that the next few days would be critical. There were more truths to uncover, more people to question. But for now, she had to wait. The threads were all connected, but it would take the sharpest eye to see them. And Miss Marple's eye was as sharp as ever. Chapter 8. The days that followed Lady Beatrice's death were strangely quiet, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Despite the many theories circulating, no new revelations came to light. Miss Marple knew, however, that in any mystery, silence often preceded the storm. The villagers had become restless, their whispers now full of speculation, yet none seemed to see the most important facts as clearly as she did. It was on the third morning after her conversation with Mrs. Pembroke that Miss Marple received an unexpected visit. She had just sat down to her tea when there was a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Constable Roberts, his face pale, his usual calm demeanour replaced by one of urgency. "Miss Marple, I need your help," Roberts said without preamble, stepping inside as if the words themselves would not wait. "There's been another incident." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The murder of Lady Beatrice had been chilling enough, but another incident, another crime, could only mean that the village was being drawn further into a dark web. "What has happened, Constable?" "There's been a fire," Roberts replied, "at Mrs. Ellis's house." "Mrs. Ellis!" Miss Marple's mind raced. Margaret Ellis had been the woman who had left the letter, a letter that had revealed the first true hint of the complex nature of Lady Beatrice's secrets. She was dead, surely, but her legacy, it seemed, had not gone unnoticed. "Is she all right?" "She was found inside," Roberts continued, his voice low. "The fire was set deliberately. We suspect foul play." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Has anyone been arrested?" "We haven't gotten that far," Roberts said, his voice filled with a mixture of uncertainty and worry. "But the circumstances are strange. She was the one who had been involved with Lady Beatrice, and now this." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already racing. The letter Margaret Ellis had written, warning of Lady Beatrice's darker dealings, had been the first real clue she had uncovered. And now this. Margaret Ellis was dead, and her home had been set ablaze. The questions that had begun to form in her mind now had a sharper edge to them. Was this truly an accident? Or was someone trying to erase any trace of the secrets Lady Beatrice had been trying to expose? The scene at Margaret Ellis's house was a grim one. The flames had been put out, but the smoke still lingered in the air as Miss Marple approached, her footsteps soft against the ground. Constable Roberts had arranged for her to see the scene, though he had warned her not to expect anything but destruction. The house was small, nestled at the edge of the village near the woods, with thick ivy climbing up the walls. The windows were blackened from smoke, and the once pristine garden was now a charred ruin. As Miss Marple stepped through the door, the smell of soot and ash filled her nostrils, and she could feel the weight of the tragedy hanging in the air. "It's as bad as it looks," Roberts muttered, leading her through the front hallway. Miss Marple nodded quietly, her gaze moving over the wreckage. The fire had consumed much of the interior, but there were still traces of Margaret Ellis's life scattered among the debris. Small trinkets, a broken china teacup, a few pieces of furniture. The place was a picture of a life interrupted, as though someone had decided to destroy the past in order to erase the future. Roberts pointed to a corner of the room where a small, smouldering pile of papers remained. "This was in the study. We've found some burnt letters, but we haven't been able to make anything of them yet." Miss Marple moved closer, crouching down beside the remnants. Her fingers carefully sifted through the ashes, and she spotted a few scraps of paper that had survived the flames. They were charred and brittle, but there were still words legible on some of them. With a gentle touch, she began to piece them together, as much as the damage allowed. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar. The words were fragmented, but Miss Marple could make out a few key phrases. "Cannot stop him. Gregory West. Must expose." The scraps of paper stopped there. Nothing more legible. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. The name Gregory West, again, and the mention of exposure. It seemed that Margaret Ellis had been close to discovering something that had put her in harm's way. She had been trying to stop someone from doing something. And now, in a cruel twist, she had paid the price for it. As Miss Marple left the scene, the weight of what she had learned pressed heavily upon her. It was clear now that Lady Beatrice's death had not been an isolated incident. Margaret Ellis's murder, disguised as a fire, was an attempt to silence the truth, to bury whatever had been left behind. But who was trying to keep the truth hidden? The answer came to her suddenly, as she thought back to the letter, to the information she had gathered about Gregory West and the dark dealings surrounding Lady Beatrice. The fire had been no random accident. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to stop anyone from uncovering the truth. And that truth was more dangerous than she had originally suspected. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the shadows of her cottage dancing across the walls. Her mind was racing, piecing together the last fragments of the puzzle. She had learned so much, yet so much remained hidden. But one thing was clear. The murder of Lady Beatrice was not just about her. It was about something much bigger. Something involving powerful people. Secret dealings and a web of lies that stretched far beyond St. Mary's in the Marsh. Miss Marple had been patient, watching, waiting, but now it was time to act. She would find the truth, and she would bring it to light, no matter how dangerous that might be. The last pieces of the mystery were within her reach, and she could feel the final confrontation coming, the truth ready to reveal itself in the most unexpected of ways. The puzzle was nearly complete, and Miss Marple knew that the last twist would be the one that would expose the killer, once and for all. Chapter 9. The wind had picked up again by the time Miss Marple made her way down the winding paths of St. Mary's village. It was early evening, and the sky was painted in shades of violet and gold. The village, despite the tension that had gripped it for days, still held a quiet charm that Miss Marple had always found comforting. Yet she knew that this peacefulness was but a fragile mask, a mask that was soon to be ripped away. The discovery of Margaret Ellis's death had been a blow, but it had also confirmed something Miss Marple had long suspected. The web of deceit that surrounded Lady Beatrice's murder had only grown more tangled, and the people she had once thought of as innocent were now implicated in a far greater scheme. The question was no longer whether Cartwright or West was guilty, but how deep the conspiracy went, and who else had a hand in it. As she passed the village square, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the strange fragments of paper she had found at the scene of Margaret Ellis's fire. The last words she had read still echoed in her mind. Gregory West must expose. The mention of West's name was no coincidence. Whoever had been involved in Lady Beatrice's death, and now Margaret Ellis's, was working hard to keep something buried. But Miss Marple had always known that when people worked to hide the truth, it was only a matter of time before it found its way to the surface. Later that evening, Miss Marple found herself sitting at the small desk in her cottage, her mind sharp and focused. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was one thing that still remained unclear: the true identity of the mastermind behind all these deaths. The carefully orchestrated murders of Lady Beatrice and Margaret Ellis were not just the work of an individual, they were the result of a plan, one that had been set into motion long before Miss Marple had arrived at St. Mary's. She needed to confront someone, and that someone had to be the one person who seemed to have the most to gain from these deaths. Edmund Cartwright. Miss Marple had always suspected that Cartwright's calm exterior masked something darker. His ties to Lady Beatrice were well documented, but as she now knew, it was Gregory West's disappearance and the financial dealings that had truly been at the heart of the crime. What had made Cartwright's role so fascinating was his ability to remain untouched by the chaos he had helped orchestrate. But Miss Marple was confident that he would slip. He would reveal himself, just as all guilty parties eventually did. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to Cartwright's office, feeling a sense of quiet resolve. The solicitor's office was a modest building, the wooden door heavy with age, but inside it was neat, the walls lined with law books, and the smell of aged paper in the air. Cartwright was behind his desk, his back straight as always, the picture of calm efficiency. "Miss Marple," Cartwright said with a small smile as she entered, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I've come to speak with you about Lady Beatrice's death," Miss Marple replied, her tone even but sharp, "and Margaret Ellis's too." Cartwright's smile did not falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. The investigations are ongoing, but I've already cooperated fully with the authorities. Is there something new you'd like to add?" Miss Marple took a seat across from him, her gaze steady. "I think it's time we had a more direct conversation, Mr. Cartwright. You've been careful, and I admire that. But every piece of the puzzle I've uncovered leads me straight to you." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "I'm afraid I don't follow." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I believe you were involved in both Lady Beatrice's financial dealings and in hiding the truth about her death. And I believe Margaret Ellis knew something she shouldn't have, something that would have exposed you. She was a threat, and you couldn't afford to let her talk." Cartwright's face remained unreadable, but his hand subtly clenched around the edge of his desk. "This is nonsense. I have nothing to hide." "Do you, Mr. Cartwright?" Miss Marple pressed. "Your role in the offshore accounts, the connection to Gregory West, the way you've handled things since Lady Beatrice's death. You're the one person who stands to lose everything if the truth comes out. But there's a problem, isn't there? You underestimated one thing, me." Cartwright's composure cracked ever so slightly, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about. You can't prove any of this." "I don't need to prove it, Mr. Cartwright," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just need you to slip, just once." It was then that Miss Marple made her move. She had spent days observing Cartwright, listening to his mannerisms and his words. She had learned his rhythm, his need for control, and it was that need that Miss Marple had carefully exploited. She had known that Cartwright would try to maintain his perfect facade, but the moment she pressed him about the details of the crime, she saw the shift. The moment where he could no longer hide his true nature. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "I've learned all there is to know about your dealings, Mr. Cartwright. Your financial ties, your involvement with West, and your interest in Lady Beatrice's wealth. But there's one thing you missed, one detail you overlooked. The fire at Margaret Ellis's home. It was meant to erase something, wasn't it? But it didn't erase the truth." Cartwright's face paled, and for the first time Miss Marple saw his mask slip entirely. You're wrong," he stammered. "I didn't—" But he was interrupted by a knock on the door. The moment was broken. Constable Roberts entered the room, his expression tense. "Miss Marple, Mr. Cartwright, we have news." Miss Marple turned to him with a calm smile. "Go ahead, Constable." Roberts stepped forward, holding out a piece of paper. "We've found Gregory West. He's been found, dead, near the old mill. It looks like he was shot. We'll need to look into this immediately." Miss Marple stood slowly, her mind already working. The game had shifted. Gregory West's death was no coincidence. It was the final twist in a long and carefully orchestrated plan. But now the final reveal was near. The killer had been cornered, and soon all would be made clear. Chapter 10. The news of Gregory West's death had sent ripples through St. Mary's in the Marsh. Constable Roberts had been quick to arrive at the scene, but Miss Marple knew that the key to understanding the events that had unfolded lay not in the discovery of the body, but in the actions that had led up to it. As she stood in the hallway of Cartwright's office, watching the subtle tremor in the solicitor's hands, Miss Marple could feel the tension mounting. The walls that had once seemed so stable in the village were crumbling, piece by piece, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. Cartwright had tried to hold on to his composure, but his eyes gave him away. For the first time, Miss Marple saw him falter, his polished exterior cracking under the weight of his own guilt. "Gregory West," Miss Marple said, her voice low but deliberate. "He was the final piece, wasn't he, Mr. Cartwright?" Cartwright's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. "I think you knew that West would try to expose everything, didn't you?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze sharp. "He was your accomplice once, but when he started talking about what Lady Beatrice had been involved in, you realized he had become a liability. So you had him killed, just as you orchestrated Lady Beatrice's death." "Enough, Miss Marple," Cartwright snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "You've no idea what you're talking about. There was no conspiracy. No one was trying to expose anyone. It's just a tragic series of accidents." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's no accident, Mr. Cartwright. You made sure the fire at Margaret Ellis's house destroyed everything she knew. You thought it would end there, but it didn't. Your lies have unraveled, and so has your carefully constructed story." He remained silent, but Miss Marple could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. She had struck a nerve, and he knew it. The game was coming to a close. Miss Marple left Cartwright's office shortly after, the tension in the air still thick with the weight of his guilt. There was no more time to waste. The village had been shaken enough, and the truth could no longer be hidden. She made her way to the village hall, where Constable Roberts had gathered the local authorities for the final confrontation. He had not yet realized the full extent of Cartwright's involvement, but Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before he saw the pieces align. The evidence had already been laid out, and it was only through careful deduction that the final piece would fall into place. As she entered the hall, Roberts looked up with a mixture of relief and anticipation. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice quiet, "you were right. West's death, everything, it all connects." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "It does indeed, Constable. And now we must finish this." The villagers had gathered in the hall, their faces full of uncertainty. They knew the end of the mystery was near, but none had yet realized the extent of what had been happening beneath the surface. As Miss Marple stood before them, she could feel the weight of their eyes upon her. It was time to reveal the truth. "I've spent the past several days observing," she began, her voice clear and calm. "I've listened to the villagers, spoken with the authorities, and uncovered the details of the crimes that have unfolded here. But one thing has become abundantly clear. This was never about a simple murder. It was a cover-up, a carefully orchestrated scheme that involved powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. Lady Beatrice's death was not a random act of violence. She was murdered because she knew too much. And Margaret Ellis was killed to silence her, to keep the truth hidden. But the truth, as it always does, has a way of emerging. The room was silent, save for the sound of shifting feet and murmurs of disbelief. Miss Marple continued. The mastermind behind all of this, behind Lady Beatrice's death and the death of Margaret Ellis, is none other than Edmund Cartwright. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Robert stood frozen, his face pale. Cartwright? He repeated, his voice shaking with disbelief. You're sure? Miss Marple nodded. I'm sure. He orchestrated both murders, using his position as a solicitor to hide his tracks. He knew that if Lady Beatrice exposed the truth about his financial dealings, his entire career would be ruined. So he took matters into his own hands. He killed her, and when Margaret Ellis started getting too close to the truth, he killed her too. Cartwright's face, once composed, now twisted with fury. You can't prove any of this, he shouted, his voice hoarse. You have no evidence. I have more than enough evidence, Mr. Cartwright, Miss Marple replied calmly. I've observed your actions, your reactions, and your behavior. I've seen the way you've manipulated the situation from the beginning. You thought you could get away with it, but in the end, you made one fatal mistake. You underestimated me. Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from Cartwright's as the room filled with whispers. It was clear now that Cartwright was trapped. His calculated attempts to maintain control had finally caught up with him. The lies, the manipulation, and the murders he had committed were now exposed. As Constable Roberts stepped forward to arrest Cartwright, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mystery was solved, and the truth had come to light. The killer had been unmasked, and justice, though delayed, had been served. But there was one final piece to the puzzle, one last detail that Miss Marple needed to address. As Roberts read Cartwright his rights, Miss Marple turned to the villagers, her expression softening. Remember, she said quietly, that the truth has a way of emerging no matter how hard we try to hide it. In the end, it is not the lies that last, but the people who are left to pick up the pieces. Let us never forget that it is through our actions, our choices, that we shape the world around us. With those words, Miss Marple turned and left the hall, her steps slow but steady. The case was closed, and the village could finally breathe again. The shadows of the past had been lifted, and the future, uncertain as it might be, was now open to new possibilities. Chapter 11. The arrest of Edmund Cartwright had been a relief to many, but not to Miss Marple. She had solved the mystery, exposed the killer, and watched as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Yet, as she sat in the quiet of her cottage later that evening, a sense of unease lingered in the air. An unease that no resolution could quite erase. The village of St. Mary's in the Marsh had, for all intents and purposes, returned to its peaceful state. The gossip had died down, and the once constant whispers of suspicion had faded into the background. But Miss Marple knew better than to assume that the calm would last. For in every mystery, even when the culprit is unmasked, there are consequences that no one can predict, and sometimes those consequences have little to do with the crime itself. It was late when the knock came. Miss Marple had just finished her tea and was preparing for bed when she heard it. A soft tap at her door, not quite urgent, but insistent. She opened it to find Constable Robert standing on the threshold, his face drawn and tired. It had been hours since Cartwright's arrest, and the constable had seemed almost relieved when the case had finally been wrapped up. But now his demeanour suggested something else, something that Miss Marple had been expecting, but had not yet seen in its full light. "Miss Marple," Roberts began, his voice tight, "I need to speak with you. It's about Cartwright." Miss Marple stepped aside to let him in, offering a seat by the fire. "What's happened, Constable?" Roberts hesitated before sitting down, his eyes darting to the fire as if searching for an answer. It's about the investigation. There's something you should know, something we didn't realize until we got Cartwright back to the station." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "The letters," Roberts said, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. "Cartwright had a collection of letters in his office, old letters, dating back to the time before Lady Beatrice's death. Some of them were personal. Others, though, they were addressed to someone else, someone we never considered." "Who?" Miss Marple asked, her curiosity piqued. "The letters were to Gregory West," Roberts replied. "It seems that Cartwright and West had been in contact long before we realized. And the things Cartwright said during his arrest, about the money, about Lady Beatrice's dealings, weren't just about protecting his reputation. There was more at stake than we thought." Miss Marple sat down across from him, her mind working quickly. "And these letters, what did they say?" "They were threats," Roberts continued, his tone grim. "Cartwright had been trying to blackmail Gregory West for years. He was using West's connection to Lady Beatrice as leverage, threatening to expose him if he didn't comply with Cartwright's demands. But the letters, they tell a different story. Cartwright wasn't just trying to protect his wealth or his reputation. He was trying to silence anyone who stood in his way. And that included Lady Beatrice." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. "So, Cartwright wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was actively orchestrating this entire web of deceit." "Yes," Roberts said, his voice low. "And what's worse is that we've learned Cartwright wasn't the only one involved. There's a larger network of people who were part of it, people in positions of power who we hadn't even considered. Cartwright wasn't acting alone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Who else is involved?" Roberts leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have all the answers yet, but we know one thing for sure. There are still people out there who will stop at nothing to keep this hidden. And Cartwright, well, he was just the tip of the iceberg." The conversation left Miss Marple feeling more unsettled than she had in days. The case was solved, the killer arrested, but now it seemed that the true scope of the crime was far larger than she had anticipated. Edmund Cartwright's arrest had only scratched the surface, and the web of corruption and deceit had spread further than anyone could have guessed. The village, which had been so eager to return to normal, had only just begun to feel the weight of the truth. The people Cartwright had been protecting, whoever they were, would not let the matter rest. Miss Marple knew this was far from over. Later that night, as Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, she couldn't help but think about the consequences of all that had transpired. The mystery had been solved, the killer brought to justice, but there was a deeper truth that had yet to be fully exposed. And in some ways, that truth was more dangerous than any of the lies that had been uncovered. The final revelation had not been about the crime itself, but about the consequences of uncovering it. The world Miss Marple had spent so many years observing, so many years understanding, was not the world she thought it was. The village, the people, the quiet, peaceful existence they had built. It was all a facade, hiding darker secrets beneath the surface. But Miss Marple, as always, had known better. She had seen the cracks in the veneer, the signs that something wasn't right. And now, as the truth came to light, she knew that the village could never go back to what it once was. Some truths, once uncovered, could never be forgotten. As she closed her eyes and listened to the night, Miss Marple could feel the weight of it all. The weight of the consequences, the weight of the lives that had been changed, and the weight of the knowledge that no matter how much justice had been served, the truth was always more complex than it seemed. Chapter 12. As the days passed since the arrest of Edmund Cartwright, the village of St. Mary's began to settle, but the stillness was more a mask than a reflection of peace. Though the murderer was behind bars, there were still lingering questions. And despite her careful observations, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was still being kept hidden. Her morning routine was disrupted when Constable Roberts knocked on her door again. Miss Marple had been expecting him. The investigation into Cartwright's involvement and the wider network of people who had worked to conceal the truth was far from over. "Miss Marple, I think it's time we spoke again," Roberts said, his face pale but resolute. "There's been a development." She invited him in, and they sat by the fire, the room warm against the crisp morning air. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, eyes watching Roberts as he fidgeted with a scrap of paper. "What's happened, Constable?" she asked, her tone calm but with an underlying urgency. "It's about Cartwright," Roberts began, his voice tight. "We've received a letter from his legal team. They've asked for a formal review of the case. It seems there's an important detail that wasn't disclosed during his arrest." Miss Marple sat up straighter, her mind immediately on alert. "What detail?" "They claim there's another person involved, someone else who could be responsible for Lady Beatrice's death. They've named Gregory West." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Gregory West? But he's dead. We found his body by the mill." Roberts nodded. "That's true. But Cartwright's team is insisting there's evidence that links West directly to the murders. They say Cartwright was a victim of manipulation, and West was the one pulling the strings." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "That doesn't make sense. Cartwright was the mastermind behind this. He killed Lady Beatrice to protect his wealth, and when Margaret Ellis came too close to the truth, he killed her too." Roberts held up his hand. "I agree, but we have to consider that Cartwright may have been hiding more than just his involvement. His legal team is going to argue that he was being controlled by someone else, someone powerful." Miss Marple's mind raced. This was the final twist she had been expecting. The suggestion that there was another player in the game was not surprising. But who could be powerful enough to manipulate Cartwright? And why hadn't Miss Marple seen the signs earlier? They spent the next few hours reviewing the details, carefully considering every piece of evidence. Roberts had shown Miss Marple the letter Cartwright's lawyers had sent, but it was clear to both of them that the letter's claim about Gregory West being the true culprit was a distraction. "I suspect," Miss Marple said slowly, her voice thoughtful, "that Cartwright's legal team is trying to shift the blame onto someone else. West may have been involved in Lady Beatrice's dealings, but he wasn't the mastermind. It was Cartwright. He just doesn't want to take full responsibility." "But the letter," Roberts began, his voice strained. It says that West was the one who orchestrated everything." Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. "No, Constable, I don't believe that. The truth is often far simpler than people want to admit. Cartwright may have manipulated West in certain ways, but West was a pawn in Cartwright's game. Cartwright controlled the narrative." Miss Marple stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the village, her mind piecing together the final puzzle. Cartwright didn't kill West, and he didn't kill Margaret Ellis either. But he thought he could get away with everything, manipulating Lady Beatrice, covering up his financial dealings and playing both sides of the game. He underestimated the consequences. She turned back to Roberts, her gaze steady. The fact that they're trying to shift the blame now proves that Cartwright knows. He's cornered. The truth has been exposed, and the moment he was arrested, his whole world began to unravel. Miss Marple's next step was clear. She needed to confront Cartwright one final time. Not to break him, he was already broken, but to get the truth once and for all. There was a final piece that still didn't quite fit in her mind, and only Cartwright could supply it. The constable accompanied her to the holding cells at the station. Cartwright, despite his earlier bravado, now looked defeated. His usual air of control had dissolved, and in its place was a quiet resignation. Miss Marple entered the room alone, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Cartwright looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse, "I didn't think you'd come back." "I came for the truth," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You've been hiding something, Mr. Cartwright. Something more than just your involvement in Lady Beatrice's death." Cartwright scoffed, but there was no real conviction behind it. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple? I've told you everything. I killed Lady Beatrice because I had to. She was a threat, and Margaret Ellis, she had to be silenced." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "But not everyone you've been involved with has been a victim, Mr. Cartwright. There's a bigger story here, and I believe you've been protecting someone else all along." He was silent for a moment, his face flickering with something, fear, guilt perhaps. But then he looked away. "You're right," he admitted quietly, "but you won't believe who it is. I didn't want to protect him, but I had no choice." Miss Marple waited, her expression softening slightly. "Who, Mr. Cartwright? Who are you protecting?" "It was never just about me," Cartwright whispered. "It was about Gregory West. I was only doing what he told me. I didn't know how deep it went, but West, he had connections that were far beyond what any of us realized, and he threatened me. He threatened to ruin me." Miss Marple's heart sank. She had suspected as much. Cartwright's confession confirmed what she had known all along. The true villain had never been Cartwright. He had been a pawn in a much larger game. But now, that game was over. The last truth had been revealed. As Miss Marple left the station, her mind was clearer than it had been in days. The investigation had concluded, and the mystery was solved. But as she looked out over the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process, something that couldn't be regained. The consequences of the truth were not always clear, but one thing was certain: the village would never be the same. Chapter 13. The sun had begun to set over St. Mary's in the marsh, casting long shadows across the quiet village. The day's events had unfolded with the kind of calm that always followed a storm. The arrest of Edmund Cartwright had been swift, but the revelations had stirred something deeper in the village, something that would never quite settle. Miss Marple stood at the window of her cottage, her thoughts racing. The mystery that had begun with Lady Beatrice's murder had now come to a close, but it had taken longer, been more tangled, and left more scars than she could have ever predicted. Cartwright was in custody, Gregory West was dead, and the truth about the web of deceit had been uncovered. But the consequences of those truths, of the lives lost, of the web spun and broken, had been far more profound than anyone could have imagined. It had started with a single murder, but Miss Marple knew that beneath it all, the story had always been about something more: power, greed, and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. Cartwright had killed Lady Beatrice because she had known too much, because her dealings threatened to expose him. He had silenced Margaret Ellis to stop her from revealing what Cartwright had tried so hard to hide. But it had never been just about Cartwright. The true puppet master had always been Gregory West, a man whose power stretched far beyond the reach of any ordinary villager. West had been a shadow, lurking in the background, pulling strings, controlling the narrative. He had used Cartwright as a pawn, manipulating him for his own gain. But Cartwright, for all his faults, had not been entirely without remorse. When West became too dangerous, too much of a threat, Cartwright had taken matters into his own hands, but by then it was too late. West's death had been inevitable, but it had left behind a trail that Miss Marple had followed with careful precision. As Miss Marple turned away from the window, she was startled by a soft knock at her door. It was Constable Roberts, looking more tired than she had ever seen him. "Miss Marple," Roberts said quietly, stepping inside. "I thought you should know. We've completed the last of our investigations. Everything's come to a close." "I'm glad to hear that," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, but with an underlying note of sadness. "What have you found?" Roberts sighed and sank into the chair beside her. "We've confirmed everything. Cartwright's confession was accurate. We found the evidence linking him to Lady Beatrice's financial dealings, and West's involvement in the entire scheme was as extensive as we feared. But there's more." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "More? West's death wasn't the end of it," Roberts said, his voice heavy. "The people behind him, his connections, well, they've started covering their tracks. It's not over. There are others involved, and they're trying to make sure nothing else comes to light." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "But Cartwright is in custody. What else can they do?" "They've been trying to erase all evidence of their involvement," Roberts continued, "and they'll stop at nothing. But I think we've reached the end of the line. With Cartwright's confession and the evidence we've gathered, I believe we have everything we need." Miss Marple paused, considering his words. "It's never truly over, is it, Constable?" "No," Roberts replied, his tone solemn. "But the village is safe now. Cartwright won't be able to harm anyone else." Miss Marple nodded, though she didn't share the constable's certainty. The webs of corruption had been torn apart, but there were always more lurking in the shadows. She had seen enough in her years to know that the fight for truth never ended. It simply changed form. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the fire, she reflected on everything that had happened. The case had started with a single murder, but it had uncovered a world of lies, deceit, and betrayal. Lady Beatrice, Margaret Ellis, Gregory West, and Edmund Cartwright all had played their parts in the unfolding drama, but it was Miss Marple who had been the true key to unlocking the mystery. She had known from the very beginning that the truth was always more complicated than anyone imagined. Cartwright had been a man driven by fear and greed, but his actions had been manipulated by a greater force, a force he could not control. Gregory West had been the true mastermind, but in the end, it had been his own ambition and arrogance that led to his downfall. The truth had been revealed, but Miss Marple knew that it would always come with consequences. The village, for all its peace, had been forever changed by the events that had transpired. The people who had lived here, so many of them, ordinary and unsuspecting, had been caught in a larger game, a game they had not fully understood until it was too late. Miss Marple's mind returned to the words she had heard over the years. Truth always comes to light. It was a sentiment she had held close throughout her life, but she now realized that truth, when uncovered, was not always a simple answer. It could bring justice, yes, but it also left scars. It could restore peace, but it could also unravel the very fabric of society. And sometimes the consequences of uncovering that truth were more far-reaching than anyone could anticipate. The fire crackled softly as Miss Marple sat in silence, her mind still turning over the details of the case. She had done what she set out to do. The murderer was in custody, the conspiracy unravelled, and the truth revealed. But now, more than ever, she understood that in this world there were always more questions to be answered, more shadows to be uncovered. And so, as the embers burned low, Miss Marple allowed herself a final thought. A thought not of triumph, but of understanding. The village had its secrets, yes, but so did everyone. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. The truth, no matter how hard we try to hide it, will always find its way to the surface. But once it's out in the open, it's never truly gone. It lingers, reshaping everything it touches, and leaving behind the undeniable mark of what has been lost, and what has been gained.